Hello and welcome back to the second part of the Miria casual art video that I do. We finished off the line work last time, well, I did, and now it's on to basically the finishing touches, as it were, which involve colouring in some base colours to decide, what colour different bits are going to be and flesh them out a bit in that way, and then shading, which is two parts denoting form and also illumination, and then designing the actual background that will go behind the character. So the references that I bring up here for getting an idea of what the colour is, and just currently modifying some of the line work I didn't like last time, which is a good thing about doing it digitally, and you can just go and do that quite easily if it does. You can see actually much later on there's a section of the hair I dislike, and I just sort of rearrange it even though I'm like at the stage where I'm almost finishing the piece. But anyway, the references, the two that I brought up that I thought were interesting are basically fan colorings and fan designs of the outfit she wears. And they brought some interesting ideas, like with the belts on the legs, that while I didn't exactly adopt, I kept them in mind for colouring them in a different way to the main outfit, to give it a bit more of an interesting look, so it wasn't just all one big bland colour. It had distinctive sections. But here I'm trying to blend in the colours, but there isn't really, to my knowledge, a good tool that allows that for Krita. So I end up just having to find a happy medium on the fly. But I'm quite happy with how it turned out, a sort of teal colour. And I decided that, thankfully the cape doesn't end up that colour, because it would look a bit bland if I did that. But it ended up working as a nice combination of the two, and I actually found an actual cover from the manga of a colour cover of this sort of outfit, and it did end up being generally the similar colour that I was working with, so I decided to roll with it. And this process is actually the easiest part, just putting in block colours for each section and seeing if it works, seeing if I like how it looks. And I suppose this is kind of a basic hint at the moment, but with digital colouring in like this, it works to create separate layers for each individual part that you're colouring and shading. You can add as many as you want, as many as you're comfortable with, but it's just a good idea to keep sections that are of a different colour separate from each other, and the same with shading as well. What I do in this video, and with this project, is that I have the base colours separate for each section, and then I make separate shading layers for each section as well, for light and dark. You can go even further than that, and split the dark shading away from the light shading. But I didn't find it was terribly necessary, for me anyway, because the way the light works, those two bits of shading would be kept quite separate from each other and wouldn't mix an awful lot. That's generally what the base colour is for, after all, to denote the happy medium that they sort of differ from. The light shading, the highlights emphasising where the light catches it the most, and of course the dark shading denoting where there really isn't a lot of light. So that's what the colour ends up. The cape, I decided to get a sort of very, very dark purple colour, which I ended up quite liking. It was like with the hair as well as actually with the hair I'm gonna start complaining about the Claymore hair now. It's very, very blonde, very sort of very bright, as it were, but not overpoweringly bright. That's sort of like just garish yellow. So there's very little differentiation between the hair, and you can see when I pick out the colours that the hair and the skin colour are generally very similar, because they have very pale skin, because fuck diversity, I guess, and very blonde, pale hair. So I decided to accentuate the colours a bit more, so that the hair was more blondie coloured, and the skin was less pale. So I ended up liking how it looked there because it made the different sections more distinctive. But yeah, who knows? And there's me trying to find a base color. All these end up being really a bit too light, so I just turn it way, way down, and you get this sort of. Oh, okay, it wasn't purple. It was a sort of. It's a little bit purple. That's weird because it's not on the color wheel. It looks. No, never mind. It ends up looking quite like it's got a hint of purple in it, but isn't otherwise a very dark cloak, which I quite like. And the importance of that sort of dark colour of the clothing and the cape is to sort of contrast with the pale skin colour and the hair. Generally, anyway. So, I was talking about the references and comparing them with the actual reference. You saw the actual reference there. It's a bit more greenish, but with things like this, you're given a lot of leeway because there isn't so much of an official colour to the design. Like the manga itself was in black and white, and as much as you have that idea from the reference of the cover of what it generally is, you can just use that as a baseline for building on it to build separate colours or accentuate different things. Like I really like the fan design that put the belts around, although I didn't really end up going with it because I would have had more line art, and it didn't really make a lot of sense. Like, why would you have a belt there? So I just decided to make it a different colour strap, and there's me complaining about how similar the skin and hair colours are in that reference. Although I think that's more to do with the hue of the actual shot there, rather than the colours themselves. Miria has a sort of reddish look to her hair that the others don't quite have, so I tried to get a sort of balance of it looking kind of orangey, but not really. Again, I really hate how like pale the hair is, because it's really hard to make distinctive compared with the colour, and it's hard to just do a colour steal, as it were, with the tool. And there's me listening to Nightwish. Tired to Ruin is best. So they end up just bending something the same colour, and you don't get a lot of distinction. But yeah, that's a lot redder than what I originally gave. I decided to just completely do over and make it a bit more orangey yellow. Although again, it's a very light version of that colour, so it doesn't quite come out the same way. But this is nearly done with the base colouring. The base colouring is very easy because it's just one colour to denote this is what the median is for the colour of what I'm going to work with. And then the shading is a bit more complex because I have to think about, well, where's the light coming from? How is it going to affect this? Even though this is in the direction for light, is it going to catch it, and where exactly would it do that? Where should I highlight, and where should I just make it slightly lighter, or where should I just not leave and not touch at all? And you can see me move around with that quite a bit, well, especially when it comes to the tight-fitting clothing. So I'm like, well, how much... It's going to catch a lot of light where it is, but where is it going to catch it the most? Do I want to completely overshadow the median colour for this highlight? And I tinker with it in quite the same way I tinker with the proportions of the light, because it's just as important as getting the proportions right, getting the lighting right, because, like I said before, it helps to denote form. And if you get that wrong, then it suggests something very unusual about the form. So, both that and getting proportions are perhaps the most difficult part of doing paintings and drawings like this. Because it's hard to get right, but it's easy to spot when it gets wrong. When you get it right, it doesn't really get noticed, and that's the plan. It's like good editing, I suppose. But when you get it wrong, it can be quite painfully obvious in a way that doesn't quite show up when you're working on it, because you've just been looking at it for so long that you don't quite notice it. That's why, again, it's good to take breaks and come back to it and think, hold on, that doesn't look quite right. I end up doing that an awful lot with this later on as well with the background. The background I ended up not quite liking it. It served its purpose. It was fine thematically, but I feel like I could have ended more details, make it a bit foggier and less distinct. It's hard to describe until you actually see it, but what I was going with is that there would be a bunch of claymores in the back, sort of like an army of claymores that she's leading, because again, she's the de facto leader of the claymores. But I think it might have benefited from being smaller. So it was further away, and I could get away with not having as many details. But there's a sort of weird halfway house I try and end up going for. But it's again, it's not the focal point. The focal point is Miria. So as much as I'm dissatisfied with how it turned out, it's not to the point where I'll go back and do over. It's a point where I'm like, this is acceptable, but I need to learn from it. But I'll leave that to you when you actually end up seeing it. Right, so now that I've gone over the base color stuff and the shading that is actually going on right now, now I look at it and pay attention to it. Let's talk a bit more about why I chose Miria and why I think she's one of the more interesting characters of Claymore. I suppose another point to start off is why I'm interested in Claymore in the first place. I'm a big fan of gothic horror sort of stories, and I would describe Claymore in a sense that as a story that has gothic horror properties to it. While not, you could argue it's not gothic horror, but it has so many elements to it that I think it could fall under that category. And for me, gothic horror is characterized by first off these beastly demonic beings of some description, or some sort of supernatural force that you don't quite understand, but also that supernatural force reflects in some way something about humanity and human beings, and the humans that face them, to an extent, have something beastly and demonic about themselves that gets accentuated. Like with Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, they're both great examples of, well for me anyway, what gothic horror is. And to a lesser extent Dracula as well, although, because with Dracula you have the vampire, character that has the sort of, that emphasises like the human sin of greed and a fear of infection and so on. But it doesn't really reflect that so much in the characters themselves, besides perhaps Mina. But then again, Mina in the book is I think Mina in the book is great, but she doesn't really demonstrate anything particularly shadowy and demonic about herself as a character. So, anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Anyway, that's what Gothic horror means to me. I think Claymore accentuates that because of course, the beasts that the Claymores fight, but the fact that they themselves are beastly as well. If they rely too much on their Yoma power, they will turn into these horrible beings that are much stronger than the Yoma they actually fight, and that becomes a significant part of what Claire, never quite sure what that name, ends up doing during the latter half of the anime, and much later on in the manga as well. The normal Yoma just sort of fall back to the wayside and aren't really dealt with. By her, anyway. But with Miria, what I like about Claymore with regards to how it handles the Claymores themselves is that, like with Attack on Titan, you have this really dire situation where you're struggling to deal with these big, horrible beings that are generally very, very powerful, and most of the time more powerful than you are. I do end up adding more shadow later on, but not at this point. Again, I'll just play with it and it's more fluid. But anyway, I was talking about the fact they're facing these huge amount of threats, but they do it anyway because it's what they have to do, and also because they have something that they feel is worth protecting. To more an extent for Attack on Titan than Claymore, but in a way, I like that about Mira's character, because she is somebody who quite vehemently believes in the need to look after her own. More so than almost any other Claymore, she is someone who is diligently motivated towards ensuring the best for the Claymores and making sure that essentially deaths are not in vain. And in a sense, she plays a long game with this one. When she first appears in both the anime and the manga, you see a Miria who's sort of who's cynical and sort of defeatist about everything. she meets Claire when they're assigned to a team to deal with an awakened one, and she she has an attitude that essentially just says, "Okay, how many of these people are going to live by the time we're done? Am I even going to survive this?" And for her, it's very dire. But after all that's done, and we see not only that they survive, but that they also have a power that is to be feared, which will be seen later. They have a much greater control of their human power. We see a bit more of what actually motivates Miria to do what she does. And she is, it's not exactly spoilerific to say that she is by no means a fan of the organisation. She is someone who values claymores and not those who basically make them and lead them. She has great mistrust of the organisation. So, she is essentially, as I said before, a rebel character. But she's not a rebel motivated for selfish ambitions like you could argue Claire is. She is someone who does it because she wants what's best for the claymores that she works with. She has seen so many of them die, and so many of them sent almost pointlessly to fight, that she is getting sick to death of it, and she wants to save as many as she can, while also turning them against the system and the organisation that forces them to essentially throw their lives away. And that's why she becomes such an important character later on in the series, and why I like her so much, because she's a rebel revolutionary figure, but she's not someone motivated by selfish ambitions. She does it because she wants to look after the people she fights and dies for, essentially. Although she doesn't, actually. Anyway, that's perhaps spoilerific, and I should probably cut that out at some point, but hey. That is why I chose this character, and why I end up liking this character more than Claire or Teresa or any other character, really. She's the one that I think is the true protagonist. Claire is sort of like the Guts. And I'm going to talk about Berserk now. She's a bit like Guts, a bit like Batman, in that everyone around her is generally more interesting than she is. She's quite selfishly motivated, and she's sort of like not terribly emotional. She's not as bad as like, "Oh, Batman, no. I have a very grudgy voice." Sort of Christian Bale style. Yeah, no, Christian Bale's not the most amazing Batman, but he's an alright Batman anyway. Getting sidetracked again! But it's another scenario, another series where I think the side characters are more interesting than the main characters. I think the same way about Attack on Titan as well, and with Berserk to an extent, although I don't think Ghost is too bad. I just wait for the damn series to actually be finished. So those of you who don't follow Berserk, by the way, I'm just going to point this out. The second to most recent chapter came out in October 2014, I think, and the one that's supposed to follow it came out in June 2015. So a lot of fans of the series have basically given up any hope of it actually ever being finished, because Jesus Christ. So, yeah, that's fun. Waiting around for that. So now I'm getting on to just adding a few more touches to the shading. I decided I didn't like the line art for the scar there because it looked a bit flat. So I decided to get rid of it completely and just rely on the shading and colours, because that's a thing that doesn't really need hard lines to define it. It contrasts quite a bit with the actual pale skin, so it's fine to have that there. And what I'm doing here more specifically is smoothing out the edges of the shading so that it looks a bit more natural, really. I get like I just turned down the opacity down of the brush to sort of, and of course add some like lighter or darker colours where appropriate to smoothen things out and make it blend a bit more, because again, there isn't really a good blender that I've found with Krita. I mean, if you know a good blending tool, that'd be lovely, but this is the way I found it ended up working out, so that's what I went with. So this ended up being a lot bluer, and of course the highlights of the cape, the cloak, ended up being much purplier. Actually, while I've gone and got sidetracked, I'm trying to remember who voiced Batman in the animated series in Arkham Asylum. I've got Arkham Asylum right here. Who was it? Kevin Conroy, that's the one. Oh my god, that voice is fantastic. And Mark Hamill as well. Mark Hamill is the Joker. Pretty darn solid. Gonna have to cut out all of that scraping. So that's why I like Miria, and more generally, I suppose, why I like Claymore. It's the problem I have with Claymore, however, is that it's one of those weird series where it's supposed to be like action heavy and so on, but the fight scenes are the most boring part of it, which is hard. I suppose that's hard to describe, but yeah, it's not terribly interesting because it's like over 9,000 level bullshit at some points, especially whenever Priscilla's involved. Fuck Priscilla. That made me drop the series for a long. No, that's Dream Theater, by the way. I was listening to. Not really matters too much, but hey, playlist Dream Theater. But that's why I ended up dropping the series a while ago, and I just skipped to the end because the series has indeed ended. It is no more. It is the dead. But in a conclusive way, rather than the creator just gave up and fobbed off kind of way. What I like about Claymore is the characters and the situation that they're put up against, but the fight scenes kind of get in the way of that sort of those character moments, so I never really ended up liking them, and they went on for so bloody long, Jesus Christ. And anybody who's wanting to get into the Claymore series, the anime specifically, a word of advice I think pretty much everybody who's a fan of Claymore will tell you, please, 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 don't watch the final episode. Not only is it non-canon, but it's also just incredibly trite. It's just... oh dear. I mean, if you have a problem with how long the fight scenes last in the series, then you look at just how pointless and pathetically handled episode 25 is, and you'll just think, oh god, why did they even bother? Why they bothered was they overtook the manga. That's why they bothered doing that. So, once you get to episode 24, stop watching, check out the manga. Because that's where the real story continues. And even then, the manga's just as bad with its fight scenes, I think. Ugh. But anyway, that's enough complaining. We are very nearly done, or I was very nearly done, for this is me speaking in the present, which is now the past. Talking about something that happened in the past, which is now even further in the past. Yes. And so I add these little touches, and soon enough I start working on the background. Which is something I don't really tend to do backgrounds an awful lot in the past, so this is something that is somewhat new to me. I mean, I've done backgrounds before, but they haven't been terribly detailed, I haven't put that much effort into them before, and other times I've just basically used a stock picture. But for this I decided a stock picture was, no, that is too crass for an artist. I must go beyond and make something new. And something new I did indeed make. And, yeah, it was alright, I suppose. Oh, look, a pun on Another Day by Dream Theater. How very clever of me. And so we get to the final part of this video, which is designing the background. As I mentioned before, the general idea behind the background is that it is an army of claymores. Just loads of them together charging towards, well, not really charging towards, but marching and approaching an enemy. Whoever it so may be. It may even be you, watching on your screen, with Miria scowling ahead of you, about to take your face off for whatever reason. But that's not really what was intended. It is, of course, it's meant to be reminiscent of a certain scene during the manga, which again I will not mention, because it is spoilerific, but there is an army of claymores being led by Miria to an extent, and this is sort of to evoke that scene and emphasize that role that Miria has. So there are a bunch of claymores in the background. On a generally foggy environment, like a sort of fog of war kind of deal. That was the idea behind that, as well as the fact that it just allowed me to have a very pale background without it looking too dull. The fog gave it a bit more depth, and eventually I do something with the sky to make it look, skyish. But at the moment, I'm just doing silhouettes that will gradually get developed. You have the lighter ones at front, dark ones at back, and it's just there. You get less and less detail the further back you go, and to sort of accentuate that there's this big crowd behind her. And here I noticed that I had duffed something up with the eyes. In particular, I did not colour in the eyes on their own separate colour layer, because I was lazy. So I went and fixed that. Miria herself is completed, save for a few extra changes I make to the liner. I decided to trim a bit of the lines to make them a bit neater, but only for so much. The background I ended up tinkering with a lot, because again, I wasn't satisfied with, I wasn't quite satisfied with the level of detail versus the fogginess of the background. It didn't look quite right, it still looked kind of flat, I suppose. And I made a few changes with airbrushing at sides to sort of blur it out a bit, and adding a bit more hard lines to emphasise at a certain opacity as well, to emphasise the form, and some. It's up to you, I suppose, to determine whether it worked. But for me, I felt there could have been more done with it. But at the same time, it was during such a late stage of the piece that I decided, you know what, this isn't the focal point. The background is not the focal point of the piece, and I don't need. It's going to be out of focus anyway with the fog and everything. So I'm happy to leave it where it is. But next time I'm going to have to think and put a lot more time towards the background. So it's serviceable, but I think it's the weaker point of my design here. But anyway. Right here you're just seeing the early stages. That's me doing the hard line to denote where the form is and where I'll be airbrushing bits out, and just adding in darker colours to emphasise there are forms behind there that are absorbing some of the light that's coming through, as it were. It's not just going through and showing the background. There is a form there. And next I add the fog layers. In the back fog layer is of course the layer that's near where the actual Claymore army is over there. And then I add a front layer that goes around the legs. And of course I change the light variables to emphasize certain clouds, and there was that random white bit of paint there that I just struggled for ages to find out what the hell it came from, and it turns out Lion Layer 2. Amazing. So there's another reason why I didn't need to put too much effort on the boots, and didn't even need to design the feet anyway, because it was going to be covered up by fog. And then I designed a background, which was originally going to be a sort of pale grey sky with like uniform clouds, but then I decide I like the idea of there being darker clouds coming over and it's sort of like foreboding and such. And that background would have been fine, I think, but I tinker with it a lot and I end up not liking it, and I pull it back, and so on and so forth. And it's just this back and forth until I get to a point where I'm happy to say I am done. So there isn't really much else to say about the background, so I suppose at this point I can talk a bit more about what future videos of this sort would end up being like. I think I've gone over the basics of generally what I do when I do my sketching, my line art, my shading, my background design, and so on, and specifics I could go through in videos, but the basic stuff I don't really need to talk about anymore. So I'll probably end up talking a lot less, and I've been musing about the idea of getting some sort of unlicensed music to just play around the background at like a low level, because I wouldn't really be talking as I do in this one and the past one, where it's just free form, as it were. It's all in one. Well, and this one in the behind the scenes isn't really in one take. It's in 3 segmented pieces of narration, but the prior one was just all 30 minutes, and it was, oh god, it was draining. So, yes, I think in future videos I will have certain sections of my own narration dedicated to talking about specific things, like my intention behind design, what certain technique I take that's very specific, and or if I try something new and I'm like, this is what was going through my head, and then this happened, and I was like, oh no. And I might also play a bit more with livecom at early stages of development, so I can talk about what's going through my head while I'm trying to design a piece, and where things are going to be, where focal points are, what colours I'm going to use, and the reasons behind them, and so on. But that's all for future. And also, if you're watching and you have a YouTube account, please leave a comment if you have any suggestions yourself as to what you'd like to see from my videos or my art. Would you like to see me talk about things more? Is there anything you'd like me to cover? Or would you just like me to talk less and just play something monotonous or catchy in the background? I don't know, jazz is quite good for background music, as well as electronic stuff, actually. I need to listen to more Pendulum, actually, because they're actually pretty solid for electronics-wise. But I might be saying that just because they did something with Stephen Wilson, who is, again, musical Midas. But, it's still early days, but I'd definitely love to do more of these, and I'm especially going to do more of them while I'm here at home, where the upload speed is, shall we say, a bit shit. And there we have it. The final touches are being made, and I think at this point I just decide, fuck it, that'll do. Yep. And there it is. I'll also be posting this up on DeviantArt, so if you actually want to see just the still and don't want to see me talk about it, and you just want it there, or if you just want to steal it, because, you know, it's not that I would know about that. It's there, it'll be on DeviantArt, and you can have a look for it, I suppose. But until then, bye-bye.